so let me see what's going on. Okay, good. All right. So this is the kind of drawing that they use to identify whether children's development of their whole and part perception is going on. So if you've got young children, probably under the age of 9 or 8 and younger, then they're going to say, oh, I see a smiley face. They might not see the smiley face and say, oh, I see oranges, strawberries and bananas. But they're not able to flip backwards and forwards between the two. Right? They can't see both, whereas as an adult, you can see that it's a smiley face made up of fruits. They wouldn't be able to do that. Then the last category is shape and orientation. Okay? So shape and orientation are interesting because we have to decide whether the object is still the object we recognize if we turn it upside down or turn it on its side. Right? So if I pick up a tennis racket, do I still recognize it's a tennis racket if I turn it upside down? Now, obviously, as adults, we do. Right? So again, you have to kind of suspend disbelief a little bit when you're looking at this information. But more importantly, orientation, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, orientation is important to writing and reading. All right? So from a learning, from a school perspective, children who have trouble with orientation might have trouble with learning. Okay? So there's some research that would suggest that infants aren't developed enough to use this idea of boundaries, of edges yet, and so they perceive objects more using motion and a little bit of depth, right? So that figure, ground and whole part perception refines up until around the age of 8 or 9. And they're getting better and better at being able to identify an object against a messy background, for example. Right? And just before puberty, if you think around puberty, a little bit earlier, we reach mature levels. Adults, it's believed, are overly sensitive to figure, ground and whole part perceptions. We're actually way better than we really need in everyday life to do that. And we talked briefly about size constancy, I think on Monday, that idea that when something is moving away from us, the image on the retina gets smaller, but our perception of the image doesn't get smaller, because we know that thing isn't really getting smaller as adults. All right? So that change in retinal size gives the brain information about whether the object is moving away or coming closer, but it doesn't really impact the picture that we see of that object very much. So when we look at the shape of an object, and all the time you're looking at this information, keep referring back to that idea of the hat static perception that we talked about, right? What are the things that young children can find out by touching and feeling and rubbing? Okay. So newborns are definitely sensitive to the shape of an object. If you give them a preferred toy, then they recognize that toy and will reach for it. When they're a little bit older, if you present them with something novel, they will look towards it. Right? So they definitely can identify that the new object is novel, something they haven't seen before. They can perceive faces within reason. Remember that their vision is very poor, so the mum or the dad has to be quite close. Right? They probably can identify the overall shape of mum's face more than someone else, because that's the person who holds them and cuddles them and does all that all the time, as well as feed them. And children pay attention to orientation. They have trouble uncoupling that originally when they're young. So if the orientation changes, they slow down the decision making to say, oh yes, it's still the same object, right? So then we'll come back to this idea of writing and reading. So for example, the letter B, right? If you consider the letter B, we have a straight line and a circle, right? And so to identify it as a B, we have to identify that the line is to the left of the circle. Right? If I change the orientation of the line and the circle, it's not a B anymore, right? Now it's a D. So if I can't identify the change in the orientation, if I don't see that properly, then I can't distinguish a B from a D. And this is one of the forms of dyslexia. There are many different forms of dyslexia. Some people are numerically dyslexic, some people can manage certain letters and not other letters. Okay? So if your child is dyslexic, then one of the problems might be that this idea of orientation isn't quite developed enough or doesn't develop. My brother is dyslexic, but I'm not sure which form. So nowadays, it's not quite such a dramatic impact on a child's learning because they will allow a child to bring a computer to school and use a computer rather than write. It still makes it difficult to read things on the board though. Okay. Left and right, understanding left and right is still developing up until 8 years old. So we usually see some dominance appearing around the age of 4. So our older group on the playground will have a better idea of which hand they prefer than our younger group will. Especially those that are getting ready to go into kindergarten in January. They should be pretty good at that by now. But left and right, like if you ask them, is the clock to the left of the skeleton or to the right of the skeleton, they're still going to have trouble with that up until about the age of 8. So you have to be very specific in your instructions to kindergartners or elementary children, right? Because if you just go, oh, the ball to the left, they may not get that. You've got to give them a more specific cue, okay? All right, so if you remember on Monday, we had 3 items that we had to be able to perceive in order to play sports. Well, one of them was depth, okay? One of them was object shape, the object. The other one is motion, all right? So detecting motion is very interesting when you look at the brain, because now we've got such sophisticated equipment, we can see that actually individual cells in the brain fire in response to particular directions, also particular locations and the speed of an object across the retina, right? So we have different cells responding to different pieces of visual information, which is amazing, right? The visual cortex is dedicated to kind of receiving that information, and it's able to process the signals that we get from the retina. So infants, even though they don't see very well, their acuity is not good, they can perceive motion, but they lack sensitivity in identifying motion. So by about 6 weeks, they're able to follow something that is moving at different speeds, so they're able to pick up the velocity of the motion unless it's moving very, very slowly. And then that information doesn't stimulate the signal strongly enough for them to identify it yet. By about 8 weeks, they're picking up directional cues. So if you play with them a lot and you give them a lot of experience, their brain learns this information within a few months, hopefully, right? And the more we play, the more we experience, the better our perception and understanding of movement becomes. All right? Don't worry about all the research. Oh, where's the older stuff? Oh. Okay. I'll talk you through the older stuff. Older adults have difficulty with motion when the strength of the input, the strength of the signal is weak. When it's only just strong enough to send off a signal down the optic nerve, they have trouble identifying that motion. So that also feeds into the conversation we're having about nighttime driving. Because already, right, they've got the glare of the lights and it's dark, right? And then they start to develop this, okay, if the car in front is moving very, very slowly, they may not recognize that, right? So getting the vision thing getting older with driving, with perception starts to become problematical. Glasses help a lot. Street lights help a lot. It's much less worrying driving along a street that's got nice bright lights, although it's not so nice living somewhere that has bright lights, right? Because then you can't see the stars and you've got all this light pollution and things, so it's kind of a bit of a trade-off. So if we think about our sporting situation, then we've got perception of depth. We have a 3D concept that our brain manages to put together from all those bits of information we discussed on Monday. Right? We're able to identify the object, the ball. Doesn't matter whether the ball is round or whether the ball is oblong, or if the ball ended up being square, we would recognize it as a ball. Okay? And we're able to perceive motion. So as adults, we can perceive motion forward and backwards, left to right, right to left, a combination of the two, so something coming at us on diagonals, up and down, right? We've got a lot of understanding of motion as adults that plays into our ability to play certain games, right? The more experience you had with balls and games and teams and other people when you were younger, the better you're going to be at it as an adult. Right? Those of us that were dancers aren't quite so good at working out what the ball is doing in the air. Right? Not that we can't see it and we know it's moving, but it's difficult to judge that movement when you don't have experience at it. Right? So visual perception tasks, passing, catching, kicking, right? It's also likely then that our attention level plays a big role. And that's important on many levels. It's important on the playground because if I have many different colors of balls and objects and they're able to pick their favorite color, they will pay more attention to what you're asking them to do. Right? If I make them play with a color they do not like, you get much worse results from that. As older children or adults or teenagers, whoever you want to work with, it plays a role because obviously the color isn't important anymore. They'll play with whatever color you give them. But if you can cue them to certain environmental features like the seam on the ball or the ball passing across a billboard or whatever background environment you've got to work with, if you can give the person you're teaching information on what to look for and kind of focus their attention, they'll be more successful. Right? So when you guys are playing, probably attention is, you're kind of competitive and you work very hard to play your game. So when you're in your game, maybe attention is not something you struggle with, right? Because you're so focused on the job at hand to win the game. Right? But, as I've said many times, you guys aren't typical. Okay? You're very, very far off the norm. And so you have to remember that for most of the population, I'm playing it, you're throwing the ball at me and that's fine, but I'm also thinking about, ooh, what am I going to cook for dinner tonight? And, right? Okay. Very annoying. I am sorry. It's because I had to go to my other office this morning and then I left my USB key in the other office. Have a look at the information on blindness and motor development. So the definition of blindness is based upon your ability to see distance and detail, so that acuity idea. 20/20 is obviously perfect. Blindness is classified from 80% onwards. So 20 over 200 would be classified as blind. So if you have someone that you're working with who identifies as blind, doesn't mean that they have a black screen. They might be able to see shadows or outlines, but not anything more than that, possibly. So it depends on the individual. When we look at the development of movement, though, children who are born blind, remember that we said that curiosity, that visual development, seeing things around the room, stimulates curiosity, and that drives their self-locomotion. Because they don't want to wait to be picked up. It's not conscious, but because they want to get there, the brain's kind of working on, okay, how do I coordinate that, right? So if I can't see there, I can't see an object that would be of interest, then we get delayed motor development, right? And so when you work with unsighted children, you have to find another way of motivating them to want to go and explore something, right? So for example, if you're going to play with a toy, get a toy that has a bell on it, right? And then you can stand away from the child and shake the toy, or a rattle or something like that that makes a noise, you know, or a doll that you press a button and a song comes out of the doll or something like that. Anything that, because their hearing is perfectly fine and their physical is perfectly fine. It's the motivation to move that holds them back, not the capability of moving, right? So how do I motivate them to move differently than I would motivate or need to bother motivating a child who can see, all right? So you just have to work and be a little more creative with children who are unsighted, okay? And there's a table that shows you, and again, remember, it's not that they can't move. There's nothing physically wrong with them structurally from a movement perspective. It's just that without sight, we are so visually dominant that without that sight, they get held back. So for example, we expect to see a typically developing child stand up and balance on their own between 10 and 11 months. For a unsighted child, it's more likely to be 13 months, a little bit later. A typical child will walk around 12 months, unaided. An unsighted child probably won't walk for another 7 or 8 months after that. Right? They're quite delayed. So that means you have to put in extra effort. If you work with them every day, right, you could move that down because it's not physical. It's just to do with the sight, right? Think about how much you rely on your sight to maintain your balance, for example. Right? Next time you're on the playground and we have the balance discs out, try standing on them with your eyes closed. Okay? It's really difficult. So there's lots of complication involved that causes the delay, but that doesn't mean that if we didn't work one-on-one with that child, that we wouldn't be able to bump that up a little bit, right? Okay. So, vision. Kinesthesis. Kinesthesis is the fancy term for body sense. Right? So our ability to tell where our body is, and to do that we use sensory organs called proprioceptors. And we have two types, somatosensors. We'll take a brief look at, we'll go over them more when we get to exercise physiology. Right? Somatosensors are things like muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, joint receptors. cutaneous receptors, so in our skin we have multiple different receptors. You've got heat receptors, touch receptors, pressure receptors, all kinds, okay? And then we have the vestibular apparatus, which is in your ear. It's made up of semicircular canals, the utricle and the saccule. If you look at a picture of it, it's the one that's got kind of rainbows all at different angles to each other. So it can tell whether I'm upright, whether I'm turning around, whether I'm tipping over. Okay. So proprioception, the information that we get from these receptors contributes to our understanding of our body, our spatial awareness, directional awareness. How do I position myself in relation to my environment? Am I upside down? Am I right side up? Right? What if I'm doing a cartwheel and I start off right side up, I go upside down, and then I end up right side up again? How do I know where my feet are so I can put them back down on the floor? Okay. Okay, so receptors. Let's look very, very quickly at muscle spindles. Okay, muscle. Muscle spindles lie in parallel with the muscle fibers. Right? And then they attach. And so they recognize the change in length and the speed at which that change occurs. So if I stretch the muscle, I also stretch the muscle spindle, and it will send a signal to the central nervous system. Okay? The faster I stretch it, the stronger the signal will be. Okay? So it has a nerve, a sensory nerve, that goes to the central nervous system, and then its synapses in the spinal cord, and a motor nerve comes back to the muscle. So when you stretch the muscle, particularly if you stretch it quickly, this signal is like a call for help, because the responsibility of the spindle is to protect the integrity of the muscle, right? It's like a safety mechanism. And so a signal gets sent back to the muscle to contract. Right? So that can be quite useful in sport, because we can use a stretch reflex. Right? But it's also one of the reasons why, for example, bouncing when you stretch is not a good plan. Because if you bounce, the muscle's going to contract, and then you end up tearing the muscle. Right? So how much does the muscle get lengthened, and how quickly does it get lengthened? Okay? So this is a spindle. The other one that's connected to muscles is down here, Golgi tendon organ. And it's at the junction where the muscle is blending into the tendon material, right? And so when I contract the muscle really, really hard, the force of that contraction is transferred via the tendon to the bone, and we move. Right? Skeleton can't move itself. I have to contract muscles and apply force to the skeleton. Remember our laws, right? I have to apply an external force. Okay? So the GTO recognizes and responds to the amount of force that is being produced. How much tension is there in that muscle? Okay? And it also has a nerve that goes to the central nervous system, a sensory nerve that it sends information about tension and force in the muscle. Okay? And synapses in the spinal column, and a signal comes back to the muscle to relax. Okay? So again, it is like a safety mechanism. If I am creating too much force in the muscle, I could rupture the tendon or break the bone. Right? So the Golgi tendon organ is responsible for letting the central nervous system know that the muscle needs to turn down a little bit. It needs to relax a bit, take the force out. Okay. Then we have joint receptors, lots of different types. Don't worry about the types. Joint receptors that are able to, they tend to fire the most when you're at the far ranges of your range of motion within that joint. So if I'm circling my arm around here, the joint receptors don't send a lot of information. But if I'm circling like this, there's more information going to the central nervous system. Okay? So they're looking at the limits of your range of motion. Okay, so kinesthesis in infancy. Then, since we see movement prenatally, then it's probable that these proprioceptors are functioning. At least some of them are functioning. Probably cutaneous receptors. Right? They might be able to feel the limit of the space that they're in. We see some reflexes. So if the hand gets anywhere near the face, then sometimes the baby will start sucking on its thumb prenatally because it's stimulated that sucking reflex that we mentioned. As soon as they're born, we know that they respond to touch, right? If I touch their cheek, their head turns, well then the skin receptors have to be functioning, right? By 2 months, remember that we had that idea of the labyrinthine writing reflex. So if I tip them over, their head will try to stay upright. That means that their vestibular apparatus is working. Otherwise, they would just keep going, right? So we know that when we're looking at young children, that a lot of these proprioceptors and kinesthetic information is already reaching the central nervous system. The vestibular system appears to be complete by the end of the first trimester or so in the womb, so by around 12 weeks. What about the other end of the lifespan though? So we don't have a lot of information about what goes on the other end. Okay. So some older adults seem to lose some sensitivity. And then the sensation, not the perception. So you've got to remember the distinction between the two. So for example, they might not realize that the surface they're leaning on is hot. So they're more likely to get burns and those kinds of injuries around the house. That's possibly because of degradation of the neural pathway. These sensory nerves maybe are just starting to break down, or the myelin that wraps around the nerve is degrading. Diabetics, people who are far gone in their diabetes, develop neuropathy in their lower limbs, and so their balance starts to get challenged because the nerves are being killed off by the levels of sugar in their bloodstream, and so then they can't get the pressure receptor information that they should be getting, and so they start to get balance concerns. Right? So if you're working with a diabetic, you have to pay attention to that kind of information, because what activities am I going to give them to do if I know their balance is challenged? Right? I can give them activities to try to help their brain learn to use other information to help them balance, but there might be activities that I don't want to give them because they would be at risk of falling and getting hurt if they were doing it without me there. Right? Okay, where are we? All right, a couple more slides and then we'll stop. All right, so perception, so remember, sensation is the information coming in from a sensory receptor along the sensory nerve to the central nervous system. Perception is the interpretation, the understanding of that information. So it's highly individual, it's strongly based on experience. All right, so when we're looking at kinesthesis, some of the perception that we need to be able to do is the difference between a single versus a multiple touch point. So for example, let me borrow you, ma'am. All right, one of the tests that they'll do is they'll blindfold the individual and they'll use two much finer than this, two little fine pin, and they'll say, okay, how many? Two. How many? How many? How many? All right? And so they'll keep checking to the point where you can only find one. Well, someone who is struggling with that perception because either the sensory information is not strong enough, or for some reason they're not interpreting that information, is going to say, I don't know, I can't tell. Is there one or two touching me? Does that make sense? Right? So, yeah. All right, we've got to perceive objects. We talked about that. We have to be able to understand the information about where our limbs are. So how do I know what my hand is doing if I'm trying to catch a ball? I can't look at the ball and look at my hand and look at the ground to make sure I don't fall over. So how do I know that my hand is in the right shape to catch the ball? Right? Because it has to be a different shape if the ball is a rugby ball or a football than if it's a baseball. Right? So how do I know that it's right without this information? I have to have practice to be able to tell what my hand is doing when I'm not looking at it. Right? Okay. So, I want to stop and give you back your exams. Tactile localization starts on page 220. All right. You've got tactile, then body awareness, and auditory, hearing, sensation. Okay, so make sure to check that. Okay, exam. All right, so as usual, I want you to go through, check my adding up. If I wrote a question and you think you can answer it, stop by my office hours. Please hand them back before you leave because I have not had time to put them on the spreadsheet yet.
I got the bonus. That's probably why I put
Oh, wait, no, she put the right answers. She said,
This one right? Yeah, non-validation. This is a bonus right here, the 19. I have balance.